Hi, y'all. Today we're going to be talking about metaethics, and in particular, the taxonomy of metaethical positions you might have with regards to the status of moral judgments or moral standards, which is to say, what you might think about the truth of sentences that we utter when making a moral judgment. So, before we get into things here, we'll just talk a little bit more about what metaethics is all about. So there's normative ethics, which we usually contrast metaethics which is concerned about sort of specific moral judgments about actions and characters. So you make a moral judgment, and we try to determine what we think about that particular moral judgment or that particular action. So let's talk about slavery. We say, something like enslaving human beings is almost always morally wrong. That seems to be a relatively uncontroversial one. Uh, but that is a moral judgment. And the metaethical concern is about sort of the status of that moral judgment. And what we do from a metaethical perspective, we ask our questions about, well, that sentence, can that sentence be true? So one of the metaethical questions then is can moral judgments ever be true? And then related to that is if it can be true, right? If it makes sense to say that it's true that enslaving human beings is almost always morally wrong, then we also want to know whether or not that truth can be objective. And we'll talk a little bit more about what objective means here in just a second. All right, so one position that you might have with regards to moral judgments is the ethical objectivist position. The ethical objectivist position simply states that some moral judgments, not all, but some moral judgments are objectively true, that there's at least one moral judgment out there that is in fact objectively true, and that to say that something is objectively true means that the truth of the sentence is independent of what people believe to be true. So, for example, take the sentence, "The earth is round." So this is outside of the ethical domain, but it's a good exemplar of something that we seem to think is an objectively true or false sentence, which is to say that its truth value does not depend on what people think about the shape of the earth. So the shape of the earth sort of is what it is, regardless of what you think about it. So even if everyone were to think, for example, that the earth was flat, that would not make the earth flat. The earth would continue to have the shape that it has, and I'm assuming that it's round, but it will continue to have the shape that it has regardless of, or I should say, independently of what people believe about the shape of the earth. So getting back to sort of moral judgments, objectivists believe that way about morality, at least about some moral judgments and moral statements, that there's at least one objectively true moral judgment. And if you want a good candidate for one, we can try this moral judgment, that enslaving humans is almost always morally wrong. That an ethical objectivist might look at that and say, well, yeah, that's one of them. That's one of the objectively true moral judgments out there, that enslaving humans is almost always morally wrong. Okay, so if you're not going to be if you're not going to endorse ethical objectivism, then what that makes you is a moral skeptic. That makes you either an ethical relativist or an ethical nihilist. So both of these skeptical positions reject the objectivist position that there are objective moral truths. So the sort of weakest rejection would be ethical relativism. So ethical relativism says, yeah, there are no moral judgments that are objectively true, but there is moral truth, that you do have moral duties, that you do have reasons to act morally. It's just that those moral truths and moral judgments are relative or dependent on what people believe. So for example, just to pull it outside of the realm of ethics for a second, the sentence chocolate peanut butter is the best flavor of ice cream is not a sentence that most people would look at and say that is an objectively true or false sentence, that there is no objective truth about what is the best flavor of ice cream. But properly understood, you could say, but it is true relative to what people think. So we could say, for instance, that for Tim Hansel, who is me, this sentence is true. This is my favorite flavor of ice cream. So from my sort of relative perspective, this sentence is true. So what ethical relativists want to say is, well, moral judgments are like that. Moral judgments are judgments about normative things like actions and character, but their truth is just relative to some framework. And so relativism tends to get split into two subdivisions, that there are the subjectivists who believe that truth is relative to the individual, just kind of like ice cream. So if you, taking slavery as an example, if you think slavery is a bad thing, then, slavery is wrong, but, just wrong for you. And if you think slavery is a good thing, then slavery is good, and it's your moral duty to enslave people. But just bear in mind that truth is just relative to you, the individual. So subjectivism, again, moral truth is relative to individuals. And sort of what follows from that is that you can never be wrong, right? Each individual has their own moral code, and they can never be mistaken. A slightly more complicated version of relativism would be to relativize to groups of people instead of individuals, which is to say that regardless of what you think about slavery, the real sort of arbiters of moral truth is the society in which you live. So if you live in a society that endorses slavery, then slavery is good. If you live in a society that does not endorse slavery, then slavery is bad. So it just depends, again, on the society in which you live. So if you're gonna give up objectivism, you're gonna go with relativism. You have to decide where to what truth is relative, right? So is it relative to individuals? Do individuals get to decide what is right and wrong, or is it relative to the culture in which they live? But regardless of what you pick as a relativist, you're going to say that the moral judgments have variable truth value, that enslaving humans is almost always wrong. That sentence, whether or not it's true or false, is just going to depend on what people think. So objectivists would say that it's wrong regardless of what people think, and relativists would say that it's true or false dependently. And so it's a kind of skepticism, right? There's no objective moral standard, but it doesn't completely give up on the idea of moral truth, that some sentences can be morally true. So it's not nihilism. Ethical nihilism is the view that there are no moral truths, and we'll move on to that next. Okay, so if you're a nihilist, you give up on both relativism and objectivism. You say that there are no moral truths at all, neither objectively nor relatively. That you have no moral duties, you have no moral standards. That those things are the sentences in which you sort of might utter just do not. Excuse me, I should say, they are just never true. Um, So the most straightforward version of nihilism is something called error theory, in which you say, similar to what the relativists and the objectivists are saying, something like moral judgments are attempts to state facts. So relativists and objectivists can get on board with that because they believe in moral facts. They just disagree on whether they're objective or relative. An error theorist says moral judgments are, in fact, attempts to state facts. But they fail to do so, and in part because the referent fails. That if I say something is wrong, an error theorist is going to look at that and say, well, wrongness doesn't exist, so you're kind of speaking nonsense, or that you're speaking sort of in error. So one way to think about being an error theorist about morality is to think of being a skeptic about religion. So a skeptic about religion, or an atheist, right, would look at people talking about God, for instance, and they would see all these sort of sentences that contain the word God in them, like God is love, or uh, God wants you to be happy, or God created the earth, or whatever sentence refers to God, and they're just going to say, well, you're trying to state facts, but you're failing to do so, right? And the reason that you're failing is because atheists believe that there is no God. So being an error theorist is like that. So not being an error theorist doesn't mean you're an atheist, but it's like being an atheist. It's just that you're sort of an atheist about morality, right? That you just don't think morality exists. And so you look around at people talking about morality and making these sort of moral judgments, and you say, well, those people are just in error, hence the name. Now, there is a weirder version of nihilism that kind of gets away from this idea that moral judgments are attempts to state facts. So you might have this particular view about moral language, which says that, well, moral judgments are not attempts to state facts, that moral judgments are best understood as sort of non-declarative sentences, like a question or a command or an exclamation that, like take for instance a question, like what day is it? What day is it is not a sentence that's true or false. There's a truth as to what the day is, but just asking the question is neither true nor false. So for whatever reason, emotivists, or sometimes we call them expressivists or non-cognitivists, believe that moral language just doesn't have any sort of cognitive content, right? There's no attempt to state a fact. There's just expressive content or emotional content. Um, so all moral judgments get sort of retranslated into something that doesn't have truth value. So if we're talking about sort of slavery, an emotivist would look at the original sentence, which says enslaving humans is almost always wrong, and they'd say, well, that's not really what people mean when they say that. I mean, it looks like a declarative sentence, but it isn't really. It's better to understand this sentence as maybe uh, just an exclamation, right? Enslaving humans, gross. And that sentence doesn't have truth value. So their view is that, again, moral judgments are never attempts to sort of state facts, and as such, those judgments are neither true nor are they false. So I guess there's a benefit in that you don't have universal sort of falsehood like you do with error theory, but nevertheless, they can never be true, and so they are considered a form of nihilism, that there's just no moral truth. Whereas with relativism and objectivism, there is. All right, so that's pretty much it for the different positions that you might have. But I want to talk a little bit about misconceptions about moral objectivism, in part because I think people feel pushed towards skeptical positions due to those misconceptions about objectivism, that they look at objectivism and they think that it endorses a bunch of stuff that they're uncomfortable with. And so they believe that they are some sort of skeptic. But I think it'll help clear the space here a little bit just to think about these misconceptions and to understand a little bit more clearly about exactly what an objectivist is committed to. So let's start with this misconception about absolutism. So absolutism is the view that there are moral rules out there that can never be broken, right? That it would always be wrong, for instance, to lie. So some people are absolutists about lying, and they think it's always wrong to lie. So for a lot of people, that sounds implausible, right? A lot of people don't believe in absolute sort of moral rules, and so they worry that being an objectivist means that they have to sort of endorse that. But it turns out that that's just not true. It's entirely possible to be an objectivist who believes in moral rules that admit to exceptions. In fact, it's impossible to have an entire moral theory that's predicated on the idea that there is nothing as absolute. That is an example of that is a theory by W.D. Ross that posited that there's only sort of prima facie moral duties, and that no moral duty is absolute. So to be an objectivist, you don't need to be an absolutist, and so we'll just sort of cross this out. So you don't need to worry about that. Now, I should say before moving on that some objectivists do endorse absolutism, that some folk do believe that there are some things, maybe not lying, but some things that are absolutely morally wrong. So, for example, torture. Some people believe that torture is absolutely morally wrong, or rape. That is, there's just never a situation that it's okay to torture or rape another human being. All right. Related to the absolutism worry is a worry about universalism, which is a little bit different than absolutism because it has to do with sort of scope. So the idea of there being sort of a universal moral rule is that there are moral rules that apply to sort of everyone, regardless of the context of their situation or the time and place in which they live, or whatever. That there's just no variability over people. And of course, again, there may be universal moral truths and there are some objectivists who believe in them, but to be an objectivist does not commit you to there being universal moral truths. So, again, just like sort of absolutism, you can have it, but you don't have to have it. So we'll get rid of that as well. All right, moving on. Here's kind of a scary one. The worry that objectivism endorses dogmatism. So dogmatism is being overly confident about what you believe to be true and being sort of unwilling to listen to other positions and being unwilling to change your mind. So being dogmatic is closed-minded and overly confident. And a lot of people think of this as not a good thing, that you shouldn't be closed-minded and unwilling to change, and so on and so forth. And if objectivism endorses dogmatism, then that seems to be a problem for objectivism. But again, that's not true about objectivism. Objectivism, to be an objectivist, means that you believe that there are moral truths independent of what people believe. And if that's the case, then it's entirely possible that you believe yourself to uh, be possibly wrong, right? That you could be wrong about your moral beliefs, and that instead of adopting a dogmatic posture, you would instead adopt a position of humility, right? You could say, well, look, I think that there's a truth out there, but these questions are hard, and you know, I haven't thought about them for a long time, or given it careful study. And so you might just say, I believe that there's a truth, but I don't know what that truth is. So that is certainly not being dogmatic, and so to be an objectivist, that does not entail that you're dogmatic. Another sort of bad thing that people like to mention and that worry about objectivism is intolerance, that people sort of concern themselves that if you're a moral objectivist, that somehow that commits you to being sort of intolerant of other views. But again, that's not true. And in fact, compared to sort of relativism and nihilism, objectivism has the strongest tie to tolerance, right? Especially if you think that tolerance is a moral virtue. So if you think that tolerance is a good thing and an objectively good thing, then you're an objectivist because it is a moral feature. Um, and and relativists and nihilists can't sort of make those claims. If you're a relativist, tolerance is only good if you think it's good, right? Or if you live in a culture that endorses tolerance. And of course, if you're a nihilist, then you can't, right? That there are no moral truths, and so intolerance is not good. So only objectivists get to have intolerance, or excuse me, only objectivists get to have tolerance. So we're going to get sort of rid of that. All right, finally, and this is for the atheists in the audience, there is concern that in order to be an objectivist, you have to be a theist, that you have to sort of believe in God. And again, it turns out that that is not the case, that there are many objectivists out there who nevertheless maintain a position of skepticism about religion. And the reason that they can do that is because they just view morality as a feature of just reality in the same way that they would view gravity or mathematical truths or logical truths, that there are these truths out there that didn't have creators, and they think, you know, that way when they think sort of scientifically, and they could potentially sort of think that way when they think about morality. So again, it's entirely possible to be both an atheist and an objectivist. So for you atheists, that's not really going to work against objectivism. All right, so that's it for sort of misconceptions, and we'll move on just sort of briefly to kind of wrap things up. Okay, so a few final thoughts here now that we've kind of spelled out the positions and talked a little bit about misconceptions about objectivism. So just a very brief reminder here that objectivism is the view that there is at least one objective moral truth. Relativism is the view that there are no objective moral truths, but there are relative moral truths. And then nihilism is the view that there are no moral truths at all. So as we sort of move forward, we're going to be kind of steeped in objectivism, that when we talk about specific ethical disputes, like disputes about over abortion or euthanasia or cloning or what have you, most people will be making arguments that that, you know, one position or another is true with regards to these disputes. So if we're talking about abortion, and we're looking at somebody who thinks that abortion is morally wrong, that person thinks that it is objectively morally wrong and that it's not just a matter of opinion. So it's important to understand that the metaethical theories that we've discussed can't help us resolve these disputes. That being an objectivist, all that it tells you is that you believe that there are objective truths. It doesn't tell you what those objective truths are. So that is not the purview of the metaethical theorist. That is the purview of the normative theorist. So the normative ethical theorist, their job is to kind of try to spell out what sorts of things make things right, what sorts of things make things wrong objectively, and then try to apply those to specific disputes. And so what we need to kind of further sort of flesh things out is sort of an understanding of what people have said at that level about, generally what sorts of things are good, what sorts of things are bad. So for example, a natural law theorist would say that anything that is unnatural is a bad thing, and maybe they would argue from that abortion is unnatural, and it would follow then that abortion is wrong. So that is a normative ethical sort of claim that tries to get sort of more specific about what sorts of things are right and what sorts of things are wrong. And that's where we'll move on from here.